and disposed within the royal chariot all the lambs. Then mounting, checked the reins, and Tenor next ascended, and to Ilium both returned. Right, well, if you guys can hear me, I'll just let you know that I'm not exactly sure where the stream went awry. All I know is that it barely indicated anything to me, that it might have been a couple of seconds, but according to Alex, it was about 45 seconds, so I'll let you know that you can find this on Gutenberg.org or any other place that you can find a copy of Cowper's text. This was published in 1771. I'd say in blank verse. And we were reading Book 3, lines 187 through 371. So rather than rereading the whole thing, I'll suggest that we go into a little bit of discussion, although there's not... I think analysis would actually make it less epic, and so I'm not going to analyze all that much. So the Greeks and the Trojans were dealing in good faith. You send forth a champion, we send forth a champion. They're the ones that actually have this problem. They will fight and preserve the lives of everyone else whose problem this is not. But if things go awry, if things go wrong, both sides have an army to back them up. I know it's not exactly analogous, but I'm pretty sure it was Teddy Roosevelt that said, speak softly and carry a big stick. Now granted, a battle to the death might not be considered speaking softly in today's world, but battle to the death was a reasonably normal event in times past. Oh, good. My knowledge of history isn't completely gone. Thanks, James, for the confirmation. We can talk about him later when when the time comes, I'd be interested in hearing a bit more about what you have to say. Um, so yeah, speak softly and carry a big stick. Or basically, state your purpose, state your intention, and then be willing to back it up. And then, ultimately, you need to be able to verify that other people can fulfill their obligations. Otherwise, the obligations are mere empty words. And so, even if it's just you doing the fighting, you need to have an army to back you up. Or some other measure to keep things I don't even know how to say this properly, but so that the result would be appropriate, because it's not necessarily on an even keel, because if the excrement hits the rotating object, it can be anything but even keeled. But and I know that I used that particular imagery a little bit wrong, but I really don't care. When the excrement hits the rotating object, when the problem gets blown out of proportion, hits the when the winner wins and the loser fails to pay the vow. Yeah. Oh, lots of people would get mad when they lost. But then again, a lot of the losers were dead. I mean, the difference here is you wind up having the people that were in contention one with another. They happen to be both very, very high up in their respective hierarchical structures. And so, if any one of them would have gone alone to challenge the other, it wouldn't necessarily have worked. So, it's not like you can just go and kill your enemy and then expect things to work out in this context. But in another context, there was this understanding that, well, that's why Mr. McNaughton, that's you ask, how would this impact societies that were family and tribe based? Well, people died. People died a lot more often. People died for predominantly because they were fighting over scarce resources rather than producing more. And yes, human beings are also a resource. Oh yeah, yes. There are family disputes that rage on for decades or centuries. And I'm going to suspend judgment for a moment and say that that does a good job of preventing there from being too much competition for scarce resources. That's the interesting thing, isn't it? If you fight someone and die, what is to say your brother wouldn't kill that person? That person very well could. And that's also why certain societies had certain honor codes. Especially if you would go and have a duel in front of witnesses or something, it was understood that there was a particular code of conduct that was expected. Now, granted, I don't particularly like the idea of fighting to the death over something. I think that there are much better ways ways that don't involve, the loss of life. But in dangerous times where loss of life was just kind of a normal thing, I could completely see how that would work, and it wouldn't necessarily blow up in your face. It wouldn't necessarily. It could, and often did. But I would imagine that would be the exception as opposed to the rule in societies that actually had honor codes surrounding this whole phenomenon. If I recall correctly, Andrew Jackson dueled. He became a president of the United States, so it's not all that long ago. It's really not all that long ago. And then there's this idea, this idea of rule of law. And then, of course, you have the idea that justice is blind. So if you say, for instance, no fraud, or no imposition of force on other people, or no whatever the law might state would be wrong, if you can guarantee that the law would be faithfully administered, then you don't run into these sorts of problems as often. But then if you have a legislative system that passes stupid laws and a judicial system that is corrupt, well then a lot of people fail to think or think that they'll fail to have justice, and so they might still wind up taking things into their own hands or just decide to settle things completely by completely circumventing the existing judicial system, because confidence in the rule of law would be gone. And ultimately, what we saw here in the Iliad was the making of a contract. It was the sacrificing to Jupiter, imploring him in the presence of witnesses, stating the terms by which they intended to behave, and then partaking of the offering. And that's how, in those days, they made contracts. They made covenants of that nature. And it was understood that breaking these covenants would be severe. I mean, they were very relatively bloody times. Relatively bloody times. So how often were things actually settled like this? I'm not entirely certain of the numbers. But I do have a figure somewhere, and I can't recall. I'm really not all that good with source material, or in terms of remembering where I get it all. But I'll see if I can find I'll link you to a figure if I can find it. Homicides per 100,000. I can't find. There's historical. Let's see. This is only the 20th century I'm looking for. homicide rate. Historical homicide data. If any of you happen to know the historical homicide data, it might actually be okay. Okay, it was by Azargot in War and Human Civilization. Pretty sure that was it. So yeah, you'll probably need to get the book if you wanted to read it, but it's basically a book about why do people go to war, and ultimately there are basic psychological and sociological principles that underlie this going to war. And competition over scarce resources as opposed to exercising a mutually beneficial trade was a big one. And if you go and you think about this in what would have been considered in those times objective terms, Helen of Troy was a scarce resource. So you get to see people engaging in natural tribalistic behavior because their higher-ups happen to have a dispute over scarce resources. I mean, going and painting it in such a in stark terms might not be socially appropriate nowadays, but at least that's how they saw it, and that was just the way things were. Kings and people high up in the hierarchical system had more say. That's part of the privilege of being a higher up, is being able to have people that are gladly, sometimes anyhow, going to go to war for you. And the reason is, at least from biological terms, very simple. The people who are higher up usually for a reason. It's because they have more responsibility. If you're there preventing people from doing bad things to those subordinate or those inferior to you in a hierarchy, then those inferior to you in the hierarchy have an incentive to keep you happy, so you continue to protect and to provide. So that's why the issues of the chief always mattered more than the issues of the person last in line for food, the weakling, and so on. The chief gets the first portion. The chief gets the biggest portion. The chief gets the choice in choice of whom to reproduce with, etc. But the reason that occurs is so that the order is maintained throughout the tribe, and so that people, because they realize that in making this exchange, they remain in good graces, and they direct resources to the person who is most capable of actually keeping things together. And so it's out of that same kind of social obligation that people could conceivably go to war over something so apparently trivial as a runaway wife, or kidnapped wife, depending on how you look at it. Very tragic dynamic indeed. And the interesting thing is, it often winds up going this way in the present day. The difference is it needs to be hidden behind a veneer because people aren't okay with the contract anymore, because the standard of living has gotten so high and people have more to lose, that you need to be pulling the strings from behind the scenes and operating in that way if you actually want to be in charge. You need to be leading via proxy as opposed to directly leading, because mostly it's due to the Gini coefficient and human nature, that when equality gets to be so big, people tend to become more resentful. So rather than being happy for one's leader or happy for the people that have made it, then the haves, who are so much, there's just huge disparity between the haves and the have-nots. The have-nots get their serotonin monkey brain working in overdrive and then begin to resent the haves and label them as enemies, as opposed to people that are actually raising the standards of living for everyone, protecting everyone, and so on. Now, I'm not going and I'm not making a Randian argument of the hyper-capitalistic businessman can do no wrong thing, but ultimately, I would argue that it's the people that do produce the most that are responsible for the people in, or almost all the people in their society, being able to have an environment in which they can thrive. And I would say that, way back in the day, that was more recognized. Just, it was more recognized when both, I guess, propensity toward envy, or maybe tolerance, no, we'll say tolerance for envy, and uh, and uh, and inequality were of different proportions. Now, with that said, I'm not going to make the argument that wealth inequality is the problem. I'm going to argue that the problem actually lies with human beings and with this vice called envy. But that conversation took a pretty weird turn. Completely logical, but kind of weird, because we didn't exactly stay on the topic of the Trojan War. But nevertheless, I would say that it probably has a lot to do with the dynamics underpinning this kind of interaction. Have a lot to do with the dynamics underpinning what's going on in the world today. I would argue that human nature is now what it was thousands of years ago, with almost no differences whatsoever. Maybe they manifest themselves differently given a different context, but we all do have a status monkey, a serotonin-based status monkey inside of us. It clarifies an important concept, says Mr. McNaughton. The fact that it's still relevant is an added bonus. Indeed. And this brings us back, and perhaps I'm beating a dead horse, but I'll continue to beat it. The fact that it's still relevant is why this is a classic. The fact that there is so much relevant is why it is a classic, and the thing is, lots of people might not be able to articulate why something is relevant because it's a form abstracted from this kind of discussion at least one level. But it resonates with people as true. The reason this is a classic is because it resonates with people as containing some semblance of truth. All these different aspects going together, they're congruent with reality. They're congruent with how people know things are. You know, people might take issue with the fact that they don't like something in the book, but they would be very hard-pressed to say that's not the way things are. You know, it's why certain films wind up being more popular than others is because they resonate with people. They strike a chord, so to speak. And the reason that we study the classics in this particular context, or in any context, is because they are relevant, and is because there are very important things to be learned. Certainly we can just be there for the entertainment value, but if entertainment is all we get from the classics, I'd say that we're leaving a wealth of knowledge untapped. But it takes critical reading, it takes critical thinking about the contents of what is read to be able to explicitly come to the correct conclusions about things, and to learn, I would argue anyhow, I would contend that alright, hopefully we're back now. Let's see. Lovely, the stream is resumed. Welcome back, everyone. I'll wait for everyone to resume watching, and then I'll continue what it was that I said, assuming that I don't wind up getting completely confused. Yeah, what was I saying? I went into troubleshooting mode and forgot where I was in my weird monologue. Well, anyhow, relevancy. I'm not sure. Oops. Well, anyhow, could one of you please remind me where I was in the monologue? I kind of lost track of what I was saying, but I was trying to troubleshoot. It's the problem with me is I'm not all that good at getting back on track after losing track, and I have to replay the whole thing to myself. So we got a whole bunch of people here. Maybe not all of us, but at least many of us who have poor short-term memory. Relevancy, war, status, Gini coefficient, wealth inequality, envy. I'm not sure. Explicitly come to the correct conclusions about things. Oh yes, why we're studying the classics. Thank you. Thank you. Lots of people don't explicitly come to the correct conclusions about things, even if they might implicitly do so. And so we study the classics so that we can explicitly come to the correct conclusions about things and learn how best to function in the world that we're in. And as soon as we stop being able to do so, these will stop being classics. Now, of course, I won't say that the fault will necessarily be with the classics. I would guess that if we stop being able to do so, the fault would be more with us, because I don't see human nature changing anytime soon. I just don't. Indeed. And I was, yes, in addition to concluding why we study the classics, I was about to exhort everyone who sees this video to not only study the classics, but to attempt to understand human nature in general. Not just by reading the classics, but by doing all sorts of other things. People watching can be fun. Saying things and seeing how people react can be incredibly fun. There are many different things that we can do to get a better understanding of human nature. Then once we get to a sufficiently good understanding, in other words, when we get surprised less and less. Oh, that's exactly. Oh, Mr. McNaughton, you were. Yeah, exactly. I was completely discussing why postmodernism is superior to any other philosophy and/or thought system. Yeah, yeah. It had absolutely nothing to do with studying the classics, understanding human nature, or anything of that, sort. You guys are so horrible. I love you. So very pleasant to be able to be here, read the chat, and so on. And the way that the way we're wired, so to speak, is kind of fun. And I'll be the first to admit that I have difficulty um, acting in accordance with what I know about human nature a lot of the time. And it mostly has to do with the fact that I see many shades of gray, or I see complexity. And I'm very hesitant to do things that I know would make me higher status because I think it would be predicated upon. Oh yeah, I went to see what Ali Al Shamsi was up to. Decided I would make a contribution. I don't really do too much there. Oh, lovely. Hmm. Good to know. Glad it's working out for him. I'm mostly there for for just going and reading a bit of the discussion and seeing what's going on. How would you say that? Hmm. How would you say that remaking the current educational system could um, could could be done there? I'm not entirely certain. Hmm. True, very true. Either that or patience. Money is probably the biggest thing necessary for me to turn my ideas into reality. Or patience. I have an immense difficulty. Yes, indeed. Um, I have an immense difficulty in actually going and conveying the ideas that I have about education, and conveying my positions, because they're built upon a completely different structure. They're built on a different foundation than that which most people approach the world with. And so oftentimes I go into places and I see things and I think, well, things it's not just that there's conjecture, though there's plenty of it, but I can be very certain based upon uh, applying what I know to situations, and applying what I've seen and what I've done in the past to the situations, that there are often better ways of doing things than what people ordinarily do. And I think, well, people, it seems like they're often shooting themselves in the foot and behaving in ways that aren't necessarily good for them. And I'd love to be able to help. Yeah, once the foundation is applied and can be observed, then it will be much easier for the average person to understand. But a lot of people are even afraid of taking a look outside of the structure that they're working in. A lot of people are afraid um, of seeing the possibilities, of seeing the potentials. I don't know if it's necessarily because they know it, they kind of intuit or get the idea that it's going to cause them cognitive dissonance. It could be that. It could be that they know that you go and you say something or do something, and then um, if you're faced with something better, then you have to change, and people don't like change. Yeah, you can't, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can drown it. Oh, that's such a good a horrible and good um, proverb. Horrible in how true it is, and simultaneously very good in that regard. But my difficulty is, because I'm starting from a very carefully thought out, very carefully put together structure. Oh, lovely. Lovely. You have your goals in life and the new educational system being made overlaps with them. That's great. Um, it's very difficult for me because when you go and you make these proposals, you go and you make these suggestions to people. Mhm. Huh. Well, I hope, James, that you're able to get what you set out for. And yeah, Alex, that that makes sense. It actually makes a great deal of sense. And the interesting thing is, I too am afraid of change. I prefer stability. I prefer structure. I I prefer order to chaos, or at least I prefer some semblance of predictability to unpredictability. Or at bare minimum, I prefer being able to be right there at the threshold of unpredictability and trying to do all sorts of new things. Which is very difficult explaining the ideas that are there. Because lots of people seem to lack the ability to switch axiomatic systems for a while to see how things are internally consistent. Some nobles you met at school believe that the job of nobility and royalty is to translate the unseen into foresight and thus coordinate the harmony of society, also a poet's job. Yes, and the nice thing is we have YouTube now. Uh, Ultimately, I would say the difficulty is getting enough eyes on the idea. And if we go and we look at who noble people are in what places of the world, the noble people are the ones responsible for controlling the majority of production, either directly or indirectly. And so that means that they naturally have more resources at their disposal than do people that are in different circumstances. And so that means that whoever is in different circumstances and wants to accomplish something needs to be considerably more resourceful. Then another thing that I find difficult is the fact that in order to accomplish one thing, rather than going and continually pressing and continually learning more and continually growing, you often wind up having to be persistent and go after the same one little thing over and over and over again. Like if your goal is to change the educational system, it's not like you can go and change the educational system 1 year and then go do something else the next. It winds up having to be something that you have to spend a little more time on, or even a decade. Like you can't change the educational system in a decade. You know, one person working full-time might be able to do so in a lifetime, but you know, it's one of those things that I could easily see if one were to start from scratch, one would have an awful lot easier time Indeed, 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 James. Apply it on the micro level. Get results and transfer it to the macro. It's the transferring process that I have difficulty with. Because even though, for instance, with my tutoring and my teaching, the little things that I've done, I've gotten results that are orders of magnitude better than what the educational system brings, lots of people just don't seem to care. You know how when one would make a promise or something, and that promise is just so much better than what is currently available, that people immediately start to doubt it. They start thinking you're a snake oil salesman instead of somebody that actually cares. You'd need to reach the threshold of, I don't know, of 100. Well, that's very true. That is very true, James. And the difficulty is that takes a generation. And it takes consistent marketing. That's actually a good point, Todd, about praising success and hating losers. Um, though I would, I would suggest, I would suggest that whatever the tax structure happens to be, that people learn to adapt to it. That, people could enter into contracts with each other to accomplish certain tasks as opposed to simply having a 9 to 5 job. One could have a contract that one works from 9 to 5, but then own one's own business and contract one's own resources out so that one could, write off things as business expenses, pay different tax rates, and so on. And ultimately, this making room for those who aren't entrepreneurs, or making room for those who aren't nobles, um, not feel envious. I mean, that just has to do with basic respect. And because we wind up having the status monkeys clawing at each other and constantly fighting for a position on the top, and there's a lack of structure in the family, and because there's a lack of respect taught to people, uh, a lot of what used to be social glue isn't anymore. Education in the past had many more outliers on the edge of perfection, but the quantity of it was pitifully low. Partially. I would definitely, I would agree with everything except for the quantity of it was pitifully low. People knew what they needed to know in order to live the lives they wanted to live. I would definitely say that. But I would say that the I would say that the problem, and perhaps I'm drawing lines and splitting hairs here. I'd say that the problem didn't necessarily lie with the educational system, but just with the means of transmitting ideas in general from A to B. Transportation, in other words. And certainly, especially with the introduction of having roads going across all the Roman Empire, that tended to help matters. But still, uh, the dissemination of ideas was nowhere near as easy as it is now. Now the problem isn't being able to get your hands on ideas. The problem is the market for ideas is saturated with so much crap because everybody with a keyboard or a camera can can say their piece. So now we have so I don't know if it's quantity of education or just quantity of ideas available to any given person. If we understand it that way, I would be in complete concurrence. Now we have the problem that the ideas are plentiful, but then people haven't gone and put them into a proper context for learning things that are necessary for going and setting out and accomplishing goals. And lots of times people aren't given a context in their lives growing up to force themselves to learn how to learn or to learn how to perform. I don't know, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on the matter. The biggest obstruction to public education being available back then was technology and econ. Yeah, now we have everything. Right now we have everything necessary to be able to educate everyone that has an internet connection to a great extent. Not completely, because there's an awful lot. Yeah. Yeah. There used to be authority in ability, education, and distinction, and now it's nearly obsolete. Partially, I would say, is because the credentials are worthless, or relatively so. In a post-truth world, in a world where you can't acknowledge right or wrong because you're going to hurt someone's feelings, which is postmodernism essentially, you can't think anymore. You can have your opinion on biology, and I can have my opinion on biology, and because both of us are entitled to our opinions, well, there is no biological truth. You can be entitled to your opinion on physics, and I can have my opinion on physics, but because our feelings are involved, there is no physical truth. And so on. You can go and have you can go and have qualitative or quantitative evidence for a particular position. And you can go and present it really well, but if someone who has some sort of emotional clout or a compelling story or can pull things out of their butt, oh, lovely. Oh, lovely. Very good for you, James. I'm very happy for you. Hopefully, you're able to use then that particular uh, clout that you have in order to accomplish your life's goals. Wow. I'm going to say my deepest thanks to you. Because ultimately, being able to invest time and money into what it is that we believe is important is very. What is this BT thing? Or maybe I'll just go and look at it. I haven't been in the group for a while. I'll take a look and see what it is. Hello, Jack. Ah. Well, I hope that whatever it was going on uh, is in the process of or has turned out well for you. Hmm. So I'm assuming it's some sort of AI-based trading thing that you can go and try different strategies, program it, and so on, and have it be more widely accessible? Oh, lovely. Okay, so it's basically okay. Well, at one point I had written a program like that and was running it on a server to determine what sorts of trades I would be making, but I haven't updated mine in a very long time. Ah, I'm sorry, Jack. I'm sorry. Okay. Excel. Excel. Okay. Okay. Wow. Like I've never used Excel. I've only written my stuff in other languages and then just done it from that, but I can see how that could potentially be useful for pretty much anybody looking to. Yes, James, we can go and give all sorts of advice. I mean, I have a bunch of advice to give too, but I I don't I I don't know. Okay. Oh, that's nice. So you basically write your own trading strategy. I'm assuming you can probably back test it on historical data and so on, and slowing down mental decay. So is exercise, chess, meditation, um, slow reading, and going through things precept by precept as opposed to racing through things. Um, Getting enough sleep. And it's interesting because a lot of the times when you're doing something like this, or in a really bad situation, you wind up having one bad thing leading to another bad thing, leading to compounding the whole situation. And sometimes it takes some sort of a really big shock to the system to be able to just get you out of where it is. Oh, okay. Alrighty, so basically this is a trading platform. It's just a different trading platform, and then the basis is okay. Got it. Got it. Then you can take uh, and then you can take particular positions in. No, no, so no, not at all stealing. Not at all stealing. Well, that would make sense. So it's essentially a good trading platform. Not too bad. Well, thank you. Good to know. Very good to know. I'll definitely take a look into it. The difficulty that I had with the group, and the reason that I didn't spend too much time there, is because there were a lot of people asking questions that I thought that they would have easily been able to Google and find out the answers, and so on. And so we're saturating a lot of the discussion threads with perhaps a great deal of what I would consider more inanity and common knowledge. Yes, Jack, if you probably, it would be best if you went and sought out James, because I can't recall my Discord user ID off the top of my head. Anyhow, my opinion on the state of science journalism, as a, not the journals themselves, but science journalism, um, my opinion on the state of science journalism is very poor. It's very poor. I don't necessarily think that science journals uphold scientific inquiry. Um, I'll finish this later. I'll answer James's comment. Filtering the information provided on Google is difficult, and ultimately you do need to have a lens. But another part of what I encourage my students to do is constructing their own body of knowledge based on things that you can know that are true, and starting from there, and then just spending a great deal of time generating the structure from which you think, from which you research. Which means, of course, you're going to wind up having to discard an awful lot of the information. Yes, going off of first principles. And if you can't go off of first principles, then you'll know that something is not knowable with the current set of knowledge that you have. Now, certainly some people can give you a good sense of direction, but I would definitely say in that group there's only like a handful of people, if that, whose opinions are actually worth anything. And then you wind up having a whole bunch of morons going and chiming in and putting their point of view in. So, just the nature of the discussion is such that you need to wade through an awful lot of crap, even in that group, which I kind of had really, really high expectations that people wouldn't go running off their mouth and saying stupid things, but they do. So that was my kind of take on things. Now, now things have, it seems, gotten a little bit. When things started out, I was one of the very first people on the group, and they were pretty good. But then, I don't know. I guess things just tended to deteriorate when the numbers got bigger. But anyhow, going back to the science journalism thing, um, there are certain things that are important um, in scientific research, and exactly, Jack. And when you're doing that on, say, Google, at least you know that that's what you're going to be doing. But if you go and you're in some sort of another group where the expectation, or at least my expectation, might be a bit higher, just every interaction serves as a disappointment because it's just the same thing in a different place. Anyhow, um, going off of first, uh, going off of the first principles of research, what does research do? The goal of scientific research is to figure something that's truth. You need to go and figure out truthful things. And so you have you have a hypothesis. And if you posit a hypothesis, you need to have a null hypothesis. Then you come up with an experiment that tests both hypotheses. Then you come up with the experiment, do methods, materials, procedures, then you get results. Then you do analysis. And then when you look at the analysis, you have to analyze, does the experiment prove or disprove the null hypothesis? It's the first thing that you look at. Is the null hypothesis the case? If it is, then you don't even need to go any further. I mean, I suppose you can, because it'll give you ideas of future directions to take the research, but the first thing you do is you look at the null hypothesis. And then you analyze, does the experiment prove or disprove the actual hypothesis? Then you have conclusions and discussion and future research. And that's how things are supposed to go. And you see lots of things going wrong at every single step. First off, a lot of experimenters do not explicitly state a hypothesis. Most experimenters do not explicitly state a null hypothesis. Most do not convey anything how the experiment is going to test either hypothesis. Methods and materials, you can just go and make a list of things. So that's kind of difficult to screw up. Procedures. So all these different things, materials, methods. How do you conduct the experiment? Results. So therein you need to understand, okay, why do people throw out outliers? You need to have a very good reason for throwing out every outlier. You need to have a very good reason for throwing out anything. You need to have a very good reason. Well, first off, you need to make sure that the procedures are done right. And then your analysis, like, I can't tell you how many, especially psychologists, oh man, is it awful. How many people involved in research are just like, I don't know this number thing. So here's just this data. Now make this data show this. And then ultimately, you can wind up having statisticians that know what they're talking about take a set of data and make it say whatever story the psychologist wants. And so, psychology research in many aspects is worthless unless the psychologist himself or herself knows what the math is actually saying. So that's one thing. Then when you go and you make your conclusions, you can't be dishonest. You have to be honest. You have to be intellectually honest. If your hypothesis was wrong, then the hypothesis was wrong. If the null hypothesis was right or wrong, you have to say that. And then the conclusions follow directly from your analysis. And then the discussion is more a thing of implications, and the future research is just, okay, this is basically what you can expect my laboratory to do here in the next 1 to 5 years, assuming we get enough funding. Or, if any of you want to do something, have at it. And I've noticed that even in medicine and biology and chemistry, people screw it up at every step. I was at one point, I would say probably in up to about 2010 or 11, I had hope, or I thought that that scientific research could be conducted well and would be conducted well, and only good stuff would make its way into the journals. But then when I started really reading and really paying attention, and asking for raw data from researchers and running the numbers and doing my own analyses, I noticed there are little stupid things that they do in order to make their data look better or more convincing. And how do you justify for the graph that you did messing with the y-axis or messing with the x-axis or making the numbers so small you can barely see what's going on to try to demonstrate that things are more linked than they are, or all these different things that you can do to misrepresent data. And methodology and replication studies. Yep. I didn't even get to that part yet. Oh man, but the state of scientific research is so bad because people want to have something to. I would say it ultimately has to do with funding because, well, it also has to do with status. You want to be able to make a definitive statement after your research, and lots of scientists don't want to be able to say, well, this is contingent upon many different things, most of which we don't know. And then you wind up having the big, boisterous lunkhead walking into the room saying, oh, I know how everything is, and guess who everyone listens to? The big, boisterous lunkhead who says, I know how everything is. And so then you wind up having everyone going and trying to turn themselves into big, boisterous, mentally inconsistent, intellectually dishonest lunkheads, and wanting your life's work to mean something. But then again, is uncertainty really lack of meaning? Or is it just indication that you need to go and plod further? The difficulty is, you need to be able to go and tell whoever's giving you money, this is going to cure cancer, this is going to cure mental illness, this is going to give us free energy, or whatever it is that they want. And it seems like everyone does this whole smoke blowing up rear end thing, but nobody really wants to admit that that's exactly what they're doing. You know, no one's going to be solving cancer because of my biochemical research. It may wind up being a little piece of something, but yeah, ideas are expensive. Jack, ideas are expensive. I believe that a decade ago, one moderately good idea with very little significance whatsoever was found to be worth about 10 million bucks. So now it's what, like worth 15? 16? Ideas are expensive. And that is actually why engineers in certain aspects have it easier than scientists. Because engineers are, while conducting research, they're not limited necessarily by the scientific protocols, unless you have your hypothesis and your null hypothesis regarding whether or not this thing that I build is going to work. Theoretical physics research? So what is theoretical physics research? I know this is a bad joke, horrible joke. There are, and there is, but I haven't read as much physics, and so I can't, or at least I haven't read physics research in a very long time, so I can't say that. Yeah. And that has to do with ultimately the fact that the people who are signing the checks have read the pop culture books for the pseudo-intellectuals. Like, I don't know if it's true, but I would say almost any physics book that looks like a novel isn't really a physics book. Like, if you can't go and read the paper, if you can't go and look at that, you don't have any business determining who gets funding and who doesn't if you can't get over your stupid love affair with. Hello, Nicole. How are you doing? If you can't get over your love affair with these really, really hot topics and explore anything, well then, I don't know. Perhaps it's just a thing of groupthink. So yeah, my idea of the current state of scientific journalism is that it's pretty bad. Not as bad as it could be, but you really have to be careful what you read. You really have to be careful what you read. Be very, very critical. And that's why there are so many questions that many people, even very, very established scientists, will go and say, oh, there's a conclusive answer to this, or oh, there's a conclusive evidence for this, and ultimately, as long as I can come up with a model explaining things given the current set of data in some other way, there's a reasonable. Alright, there we go, we're back. Haha. Right, well, we're back. Now, being doubtful, being unsure, being oh, when someone says that something has been definitely proven, you can't, you can't, you can't say that. Certainly, there's degrees of certainty, um, but as long as you can come up with a different model for um, whatever's going on that makes sense given the current constraints that we understand about reality, things that we can actually say as true or say as being true, then you can't say something is known. You can't say something is definitively proven. It just doesn't work that way. And you can take that to almost anything that doesn't have a 100% ironclad explanation. Indeed, James, you will never be able to prove, and no one else will ever be able to prove beyond doubt, or at least beyond the capacity to doubt, that you exist. Mm-hmm. Well, ultimately, or want to be philosopher. Oh boy. Perhaps. And nihilism is a real concern nowadays. Lots of people don't see any meaning. Lots of people don't see anything of that nature. So, well, that God is an absolute truth. That's another interesting point, isn't it? It depends on what sort of a framework you're talking about, doesn't it? It depends upon your axiomatic system. But then can one make an absolute statement about axiomatic systems? It's like, how deep down the rabbit hole do you want to go? And then ultimately, if you're talking about the transcendent, what can you say at all? Some say that God is an absolute truth. Some say evolution is an absolute truth. Well, here's the thing, right? You don't have proof for God. You do have proof for evolution. But there's not, you can't go and necessarily say, for instance, that certain species are related in certain ways. Because you can go and construct all sorts of hypothetical mating diagrams and all the rest of it. Um, yes, and Alex, the interesting thing at that point is that you can even start arguing semantics, because okay, what is existence? And before you want to go and reach through the screen and throttle me, with a degree of certainty, indeed, you can say a lot. And ultimately, the question then winds up being, what degree of certainty do we find to be reasonable to be able to believe a certain claim? And is it contingent upon the claim? Is there any ironclad rule, or is it ultimately predicated upon our physiology and our feelings? And the more I research into the subject, it actually seems to be, at least in terms of our humanity, that what we do believe is largely, very largely contingent upon our physiology and our feelings. So how trustworthy are we? How trustworthy is this whole thing? At one point, do you begin to doubt yourself? At what point do I begin to doubt myself? I allow myself periods of self-doubt. Hmm. That's a good perspective, James. I I allow myself periods of self-doubt. Or rather, I allow myself periods of postulating things at different levels of abstraction. Yes, to you it is self-evident, and that is due to your physiology, which means it's due to physics, assuming that physics even exists, right? So this whole thing devolves. This whole thing devolves into nihilism unless you actually have something transcendental. So, are you a nihilist? If the answer is no, well, then you have to figure something out. Even if that something is so basic as I don't know. And so here you wind up having me shrugging my shoulders, admitting that I'm largely clueless about most of the things that are going on in this world. And I'm probably never going to have too much of a clue. So, for those of you looking for absolute answers, I can tell you what I believe. But I'm also forced to basically say that, well, um, belief is belief. And at the same time, I'm a scientist. Gotta love it. Because if everything is just a concept, I mean that's actually a very good point, James. It's like here's the argument. I mean, I've actually given the argument. Well then, if that is the case, well then, why do you hate so much the idea of me loading a gun, putting it to your head, and pulling the trigger? And interestingly, nobody likes that idea. Yes, everybody is clueless, or at least once again, that's the context-dependent statement. Like, do you have an internally consistent axiomatic system for viewing the world? If you do, I would say that you're not necessarily clueless. Or at least there's a chance that you're not clueless. But then what happens when there aren't? When we stumble upon internal inconsistencies, then we have to change the system. Well, life is a concept. I don't know if it's just a concept, but life is definitely a concept. Now, granted, it's a concept that human beings have pretty much, for all of human existence, acknowledged. And then it winds up becoming a question of consciousness. So what constitutes consciousness? And nobody has an answer to that either. That there is existence and that logic can be consistent. And that is a good. Yeah. Cheap, culty thing to say. The babble of confusions creeps in with description and explanation. I don't know necessarily that, because without description or explanation, you can't. Like, everything is, to some extent, an abstraction in our minds. Language is an abstraction. Like, why in the world are you gaining significance from these weird noises that are coming out of my mouth? Like, why does my moving my mouth accomplish anything? You've imputed some sort of significance. Or rather, my words might in and of themselves be significant. Abstractions might very well be significant. Description and explanation might wind up being necessary to even begin to think about existence. Whereas I don't believe in the whole idea of the world of ideal forms. I don't think there exists such a thing as an ideal form. I acknowledge that sensation and perception are imperfect. Then the other question is, okay, if instead of saying I am that I am, what if I say I ain't that I ain't? What then? Yes, indeed, some religions try to get you to stop thinking to perceive the truth. And there's this idea that you can somehow either shut your brain off and receive truth, or shut your brain off and then kind of go into this nothingness, weird frame, or you can somehow achieve enlightenment, or all the rest of these things. It's as if somehow the universe or God or whatever is just going to go and zap you when you shut your brain off. You see your Popeye the Sailor. Oh boy. There we go, that's going on. There we go. Oh help. Oh help. This is excellent. So anyhow, on that note, I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. I live in a garbage can. I fight to the finish 'cause I eat my spinach. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. Popeye the Sailor Man IQ. Oh boy, this is excellent. This is I did not see the conversation playing out this way, but this has been a great deal of fun. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to get going. I have a lot of stuff to do today, but it's been immensely enjoyable hanging out with you guys. So thanks for your presence, and our next stream will be held at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time on Sunday. All right. CL.